I'm not mad. I'm just disappointed.
The Huckleberry Finn is a dirty little homeless little white trash creep. And the main problem is that he won't stop saying
Hey, hi, hello, welcome to my corner of the internet. My name is Fats, and I really want to clear the air before we start this video. And I want to say that I am not coming here doing one of my hater videos, one of my angry videos, and tearing this book apart. Because thematically, motif-wise, lesson-wise, bigger picture-wise, Percival Everett had a mission and he had an intent in lesson and idea and ethos that I think is important. And don't you dare get it twisted. All the themes that I'm talking about today, I agree with. I agree with these themes, and I'm not arguing against these themes. My big issue is execution. So I guess let's just get right into it. This is a bit unorganized. This is way more chill and less structured than a lot of my book videos, only because I kind of struggled to sit with this book in a way that felt like I was organizing a discussion when I just felt so much of a lack. And I was just constantly, I don't know, it was like I was reading and just going like, Percival Everett is better than this. How did we come to this? And I do think this book is worth the hype because of its themes. I do. But I think that the execution pokes holes in the themes in a way that really bothers me. But again, the themes, great. The writing, great. The intent, great. Execution is the problem. What is this book about? This book is a retelling of the Huck Finn classic by Mark Twain. It follows that story, but repositions our main character into Jim, otherwise known as James, the namesake of this story. Now, before we get into this, I found a intro of Huckleberry Finn, written by Toni Morrison. I tried to find Toni Morrison talking about it herself so we could get her thoughts, but I found the introduction instead, and I really think what she has to say is just so important when framing the discussions around that I'm going to have today. So I'll put it on the screen so that you can read along. Fear and alarm are what I remember most about my first encounter with Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Palpable alarm. Unlike the Treasure Island excursion of Tom Sawyer, at no point along Huck's journey was a happy ending signaled or guaranteed. Reading Huckleberry Finn, chosen randomly without guidance or recommendation, was deeply disturbing. My second reading of it, under the supervision of an English teacher in junior high school, was no less uncomfortable, rather more. It provoked a feeling I can only describe now as muffled rage, as though appreciation of the work required my complicity in and sanction of something alarming. Yet the satisfactions were great. Riveting episodes of flight, of cunning, the convincing commentary on adult behavior, watchful and insouciant, the authority of a child's voice and language, cut for its renegade tongue and sharp intelligence. Liberating language, not baby talk for the young, nor the doggedly patronizing language of so many books on the children's shelf. And there were interesting female characters, the clever woman undeceived by Huck's disguise, the young girl whose sorrow at the sale of slaves is grief for a family split rather than convenience's loss. Nevertheless, the second time, curling through the pleasure, clouding the narrative reward, was my original alarm, coupled now with a profoundly distasteful complicity. Then in the mid-50s, I read it again, or sort of read it. Actually, I read it through the lens of Leslie Fielder and Lionel Trilling, exposed to Trilling's reverent intimacy and Fielder's irreverent familiarity. I concluded that their criticism served me better than the novel had, not only because they helped me see many things I had been unaware of, but precisely because they ignored or rendered trivial the things that caused me unease. In the early 80s, I read Huckleberry Finn again, provoked, I believe, by demands to remove the novel from libraries and required reading lists of public schools. These efforts were based, it seemed to me, on a narrow notion of how to handle the offense Mark Twain's use of the term I would occasion for Black students and the corrosive effect it would have on white ones. It struck me as a purist yet elementary kind of censorship designed to appease adults rather than educate children. Amputate the problem, band-aid the solution. A serious comprehensive discussion of the term by an intelligent teacher certainly would have benefited my 8th grade class and would have spared all of us. A few Blacks, many whites, mostly second-generation immigrant children, some grief. Name-calling is a plague of childhood, and I learned activity ripe for discussion as soon as it surfaces. Embarrassing as it had been to hear the dread word spoken and therefore sanctioned in class, my experience of Jim's epithet had little to do with my initial nervousness the book had caused. Reading hundreds of times, embarrassed, bored, annoyed, but did not faze me. In this latest reading, I was curious about the source of my alarm, my sense that danger lingered after the story ended. I was powerfully attracted to the combination of delight and fearful agitation lying entwined like crossed fingers in the pages. And it was significant that this novel, which had given so much pleasure to young readers, was also complicated territory for sophisticated scholars. Usually the divide is substantial. If a story that pleased us as novice readers does not disintegrate as we grow older, it maintains its value only in its retelling for other novices or to summon uncapturable pleasure as playback. Also, the books that academic critics find consistently rewarding are works only partially available to the minds of young readers. Adventures of Huckleberry Finn manages to close that divide, and one of the reasons it requires no leap is that in addition to the reverence the novel stimulates is its ability to transform its contradictions into fruitful complexities and to seem to be deliberately cooperating in the controversy it has excited. The brilliance of Huckleberry Finn is that it is the argument it raises. I will link the PDF of this or figure out how to link where I found this from the source that I'm reading it from, because I think that if you enjoyed James and you want a deeper discussion that links Huckleberry Finn, I love Toni Morrison's intro. It is such a good introduction. I couldn't sit here and just read you the whole thing. But I do now want to move from Toni Morrison and give you some thoughts from Percival Everett. I have a few clips from some interviews that he did. And the first one I did want to bring up this section from the USBC News website. And again, I'll link everything below in case you want to read more sections of all of these interviews or anything that I bring up. But the interviewer starts off by saying, "What do you think is the most important thing for people to know about your work?" And Everett responded that any meaning to be found in it is generated by them. And in his description of James, he says, "When I started, I was thinking that perhaps I would be trying to offer a corrective to the story, but I pretty much abandoned that right away. Because I have a lot of respect for Twain and for that novel, failed as it might be in some aspects. So I like to see this novel as being in conversation with Twain." And then furthermore, going into how he feels about his engagement with the original texts, he says, "I would say that it can't be because it's narrated and experienced by an adult Black man who happens to be enslaved, whereas Twain's point of view is an adolescent white boy who is free. So even though there are many shared events, the fact that they're viewed from different vantage point makes it necessarily quite different." Those are some thoughts. Those are some framings. What is the book about? In Everett's story, you are introduced to Jim. And this story itself floats satirically through code switching and the construction of racial identity, self-inflicted repression, perception, identity, perceived truth, and the desire to give a voice to the silenced characters in discussions of race. All themes that I think are important. Again, that is not what I'm questioning today. As this is done in the point of view of Jim, one of the biggest elements in this story, one of the biggest rhetorical devices is the way that Jim speaks. When he is in conversation with other slaves, he speaks with a sort of Twainian English. He speaks even above those that are enslaving him. He speaks in a dialect and in a cleanliness that isn't understood as slave speak, as a black dialect. However, when in front of his owners and when in front of a white person, he dumbs it down. And Jim is the self-perceived expert in this, to the point that he even is the teacher of the children in perfecting that black slave dialect. The story itself kicks off with Jim, a fiercely loyal father and husband who has just heard through the grapevine that he is about to be sold and separated from his family. So instead he runs away, sneaks off. When he sneaks away, he bumps into Huck. And Huck says, "Oh, fancy meeting you here. I've also ran away and I faked my death in the meantime." Because Huck has heard that his drunkard, abusive father is back in town. He doesn't want to deal with that, so running is his best option. In the fact that Huck has faked his death and Jim has ran away, Jim is immediately afraid that people are going to associate the two with one another. So now he can't go back home. And Huck refuses to go back home, so they team up together and ride the river, trying to figure out what next steps are. Huck as a character is therefore a very interesting foil for how we come to understand Jim. My first problem in execution is in how Huck is very contemporarily written. Despite the book's historical setting, Huck approaches conversations and approaches initial conversations from the jump with a contemporary sentiment that feels almost dissonant to the historical setting of the book. And I do think that rides through the book as a whole. Percival Everett wasn't writing different themes and retelling in the time period that Twain was writing and in the time period that the book is set. Percival Everett superseded and threw a film of contemporary sentiments on top of this book. And I do think that brings in a huge dissonance to these characters as I understand them, and to actually leveling out the playing field in a retelling. The reason I put air quotes around that is the concept of retelling bothers me in this book, because while I do understand that we wanted to give a voice to a character who didn't have a voice, and we want to bring Black voices into a conversation that shouldn't be ran by a white voice, there are two things that bother me. One, in the writing of James, there was a huge spike in sales of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. A huge spike in sales. And two, this being a retelling didn't do anything for the book. It did not need to be a retelling. This story could have functioned without it aligning with Huckleberry Finn. This being a retelling wasn't so much a retelling as Everett really wanted to bring in a different story. And I'll argue that with the ending of this book, actually, which we'll get to later. But Percival Everett wanted a different narrative. Percival Everett wanted a different tale. He says that in the interview portion that I just read. So then why did we need to make this a retelling? It really bothers me, because one thing that I heard a lot from people coming into reading this was, you don't have to read The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. This stands alone and you get a good book from this. I would like to say that Percival Everett could have easily just have given me a satire. All of these things work as a satire, because when you as a book reviewer tell me, oh, you don't even need to know Huck Finn to read this, then the elements that make this a retelling don't matter. One of the most popular retellings, and I bring it up a lot because I actually really enjoy it, is the Song of Achilles. What makes the Song of Achilles a good retelling, in my opinion, is my deep understanding of Achilles and Patroclus and my understanding of the story as I know it, I can say that you genuinely need no grounding in the adventures of Huckleberry Finn in order to go into James, which just kind of hinders this idea that Everett says this is a conversation, this is a discussion. If you don't know the original, and you don't have to know the original, and they don't play with each other, it's not a conversation. It's a one-sided argument, which I really think hinders what a retelling ought to do. I have read The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. I think once in college, years ago, a millennia ago, decades ago. And I can say that my understanding of the book and how I remember the book and the conversations that are important to the book actually ruin James a bit more for me. And I think James would have been more enjoyable if I actually didn't have my knowledge of Huckleberry Finn. Could be argued that maybe that's what Everett wanted. I just think that he had an idea and possibly approached writing with certain intents, and then this book just became an execution of themes rather than thinking of the implications that come with retelling a story. While we're talking about things that just sort of bothered me, I really want to talk about language. I understand what is intended here. Language is a sort of reclamation. Language is this creation of agency and identity, and this story is huge on the concept of performative actions and agency and the reclamation of autonomy. The title, James, actually is a huge representation of that. His slave name is Jim. He claims the name James in freedom and in self-possession and in understanding himself. So it is a story of agency, of taking agency, and language shows that. Another thing language is intending to do in this book is show that slaves are just as smart, if not smarter, in the book. And that is the satire of it all. I, reading this, feel as if language is used as this sort of proxy for morality. And while I get that this is a satire, it does feel like human worth is therefore hinged on language and education. Whereas I think something that is so deeply grounded in Black history and Black discussions is we were held back. We were cut off at the knees. We were treated as chattel and not given the resources, but we are human and we are worthy and we deserve. Whereas this book seems to say, look, they can read, they do deserve. Look, they can speak, they do deserve. I really think that, again, execution-wise, the implications around the use of this really cuts the book off at the knees. That's my opinion. Again, I think that thematically it is important. Seeing slaves as smart, seeing slaves as educated, seeing slaves and Black people as powerful and independent and having that agency. I see that. But in its execution to write a story and say, look, they're worthy, look, they're smart, they have morality and they are important, they can read, they can speak well. Look at that. I think it's ironic in a sense that it almost seems to be doing the opposite of what I need this book to be doing. And again, what Toni Morrison has said, what Huck Finn accidentally did. In this rewriting and in the way that we use language and have rewritten the antebellum South, I want to say that this book almost feels like a remix. It doesn't feel in conversation. It doesn't feel like we're battling these themes. It feels like we've remixed. It feels like we've taken an Eminem beat and rapped on top of it. Not that we've created a call and response. I just think that discussion wise, again, but it all hinges on, I wouldn't have these problems if we didn't make it a retelling. I wouldn't have these problems if this weren't supposed to be in discussion of, actually, I think I would, in the basis of language as a proxy. I do think that would bother me no matter what. A theme that I actually have very little to say, and I wish I had gotten more, is religion in the book. It felt really half-baked. It felt like Everett knows that religion in slave life, in the Annabin himself, is huge. I would like to say that one thing that makes religion so interesting when it comes to the slave narrative is illiteracy, is this concept of hopefulness, hopelessness, and something being believed and felt so deeply without literacy. And I do think that could be why it was so half-baked into this story, because it's such an interesting thing to place historically and canonically and not know how to push that forward. And that bothered me in this book. It was sprinkled in as little discussions and conversation between Huck and Jim, but then never baked through. It was tossed in. It felt haphazardly and not treated in a way that I wish that it could have, which bothered me. But again, it's kind of hard to review a book and say what it should have done. The author didn't want to do it, so I can't mark points because I wanted something, because I can't tell the author what I want. This book was written for me. This book was just written. I just think that was a very half-baked theme, and editing wise, that since it was so half-baked, didn't necessarily need to be there unless it was given a bit more attention, time, and effort. Lastly, I just wanted to talk about the ending and just sort of get like a crowd feel on this one. One, Jim being revealed as Huck's father. Again, I think this sort of invalidates a lot of initial themes. I think that, so in the original book, in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, there is this sort of interest in a child being able to recognize wrong and being able to see wrongness, a white child in being able to see what his parents essentially don't. And Jim was a sort of father figure to Huck in the original. In this sort of experiment that Everett has, I don't know how to feel about this, about Huck being his child. I almost want to say, again, I'm not saying this with my chest, it's just kind of like me doing a little bit of a feeler and trying to put my thoughts into words. I almost want to say that it invalidates a huge lesson that Twain had put in. A little white child can see that this is wrong. What are the parents teaching it? Instead, it feels almost like, of course you can see what's wrong. Of course you learned what's wrong. You're black too. You've got some black in you. That lesson being taught of everybody can see what is wrong and being like, you can see what is wrong. You're black. It's a different feeling for Huck to be having these conversations and reaching these conclusions, all hinging on the back of, oh yeah, you're Jim's child. Oh yeah, you are part black. Oh yeah, you do have 2 drops. That felt almost invalidating to the original story. Again, this retelling just sort of invalidating certain parts rather than playing to and being in discussion with, which is just an interesting way of going about retelling, and just adds to my want that this just stood alone. I could have gained all of these things and gained everything I needed if this just stood alone. And I also still need to touch on the almost Tarantino ending. The revenge that Jim took on the awful slave owner. I'm not saying that I had any issue with that man dying. I don't. Again, thematically, I think some things were done here that I'm not mad at. However, in execution of getting to know Jim and getting to know James and seeing his plight and seeing his struggles and knowing him as a very kind and forgiving and loving man, to have him pushed to revenge and to vengeance at the end of this book is interesting when I want to look at this book as like let's say this was a classic and this was a new classic that I'm teaching to children. What am I teaching with that addition? If I were sitting down with this retelling and Huckleberry Finn never existed, and I have a child here that I'm explaining this book to, and I'm explaining the themes of this, what am I explaining with the revenge taken at the end? Because I think I just see it as entertainment value. I think this was just written as entertainment, which is hard to sort of work through, again, with this being a retelling. But it might also put too much weight on, again, what is intended with this book. He maybe didn't intend for me to take any meaning out of that revenge. Again, I was happy for it. Good, get rid of that man. Take your revenge. Erase him from this earth. But as a lesson, as a theme, what am I teaching with Jim taking those steps? Where does this place a motif in the slave narrative? Revenge must be taken in order to live peacefully. Revenge must be taken to get silence. Revenge must be taken in order to get closure. Revenge must be taken and death is warranted in order to end the plight of violence. Violence equals violence. Without violence, you cannot find peace. I don't know what I'm supposed to take from it. Not because I had an issue with it happening. And I'm not saying I want that man to live. Do not get it twisted. He's a bad guy. But I don't know what I'm supposed to get from that. I don't know. Just a quick video for you. I didn't have too much to say. I wanted this to kind of feel like a book club check-in. Like if we had all read the book together and we sat down later and we talked about themes. I just wanted this to feel like a reference for somebody who had read it and any things that I saw problematically throughout the book. If you haven't read it, I don't think I would necessarily recommend it. Percival Everett is a great author and I would recommend you read The Trees. Fantastic book. I think he is a very smart man. I just think that this one sort of missed the mark. Could have gone through a few more rounds of editing. But let me know your thoughts. Let me know how you feel. Let me know if any of these things you sort of feel differently about, or you have different thoughts about, or anything that worked for you, or if you think the execution of this was perfect, or you think that this being a retelling is perfect. Let me know. I'm open to other thoughts and ideas. I'm not necessarily single track minded. I had to force myself through this though. I did. I wasn't reading it and I'm like, oh yeah, I can't wait. I was reading it because it is a National Book Award and because it is Black written and because it is a Black narrative. That's why I read. I wasn't reading and going through it having like a jolly good time or necessarily invested in the story. I was a bit bored through large chunks of this narrative. Let me know what you think, though. Let me know how you felt about it. Let me know if you have any thoughts. I'm gonna talk to you next time.